Uh, what my in- what my intent for this is to show you a couple of slides from here to give you a background with the understanding that there will be some modification to this, and then by next month-ish, we should have this finalized in preparation for public presentations throughout the fall into the winter. This is in response to Senate Bill 6039, which developed as part of that a collaborative process led by the Department of Ecology to collect and distribute information regarding geothermal throughout the state of Washington. And that collaborative process involves several state agencies and will then engage the public in various venues, online and in person, to collect information to develop a report by this time next year. At least that is the intention. So one part of that is for us to develop a outreach story map to display what has been done. And then from this, I'll transition and show you a few screens from the Washington Geological portal, and I'll give you a couple of caveats there when we do that. So this is the story map, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to just show you that there will be quite a bit embedded in this when it's completed. It's talking about the various types of geothermal, what's happened in Washington, the focus areas where we're going to be conducting more work moving forward, and then moving more into potential issues with develop environmental framework, and then the regulatory issues connected to that. So all I'm really going to show you from this is just a couple of slides under exploration to give you all a sense of how long the Washington Geological Survey has been engaged in this. And it dates back to the 1970s, where staff at the Washington Geological Survey, in combination with other partners, including Southern Methodist universities, were drilling um, and logging wells, mostly to look for temperature gradients and to sample wells for the geochemistry. So earlier on, a lot of that was temperature measurements and geothermal gradient calculations. And it looks like some of the things aren't going to show because of the sharing. That's okay. In 2009, sort of a major change happened in that the Department of Energy put out a major call for funding, of which the WGS was a recipient of funds, and that was part of the National Geothermal Data System. So as part of that, the WGS drilled more temperature gradient wells, um, and measured the gradient in those wells as well as other wells throughout the state, and then collected and measured the geochemistry of a whole slew of new different springs, and collected data from various publications around the state on wells and springs for chemistry. So what that led to is that collected data led to a report, which is listed here, OFR 2014-02. And the purpose of that report was to compile the geothermal gradient data along with geochemistry data and present that as a favorability model for where we have higher areas of geothermal potential. This is not this favorability is not about the feasibility of doing geothermal work, but it is about the potential for that to exist. And it highlights the areas around the volcanoes naturally, but also sort of a broad, higher than average geothermal potential into the Columbia River and then the Columbia Basin. So that then led to another round of funding from 2015 to 2019, where staff, again funded by Department of Energy grants, went to the focus areas, and those being Mount Baker, Mount St. Helens, and the Wind River Range, or Wind River Valley, and drilled additional wells to then collect more detailed data on the areas of high geothermal potential, to then and then conduct very detailed geophysical surveys to then translate that potential into more feasibility of where that geothermal reservoir was and the possibility of being able to access that resource. So that led to a report in 2021 that was then published. It is a very long report. It consists of everything that we did with respect to collecting data in the field, the lab measurements, the geophysical prospecting that was conducted, and that led to a feasibility map. Which was our geothermal on the geothermal portal I'll show you here in a moment, that translates that potential into the areas that are favorable for development. So with Senate Bill 6039, which I hinted at earlier, which was passed last year, there are new things that are afoot. We are in the process of determining how and where to collect new data resources for these focus areas that I mentioned earlier. There will be a process by which we conduct and do seismic hazard assessments for those areas. Another big piece of this is redeveloping our subsurface data into a new subsurface database and bringing on a team to manage that and build that out for the survey. And then the collaborative process that I mentioned earlier with other state agencies led by the Department of Ecology. So that is what we have been up to. What I'm going to switch to now, just briefly, and again, this is a lead in to what Jonathan's going to do momentarily with the data that we have on the portal. So this is the Washington Geology portal, and that portal um, has a whole bunch of information that is publicly accessible. You can download, you can visualize it in different ways. The big caveat I have here is that the portal is changing. Now, that change is not happening immediately. The publications team here at the survey is working to rebuild the portal, given user input and internal input over the past couple of years to help design something that is a bit more efficient, handling data a bit more easily, and a little bit more user friendly. So expect that to be something coming down the pipe. Um, don't even really have an exact time frame for you, but certainly not in the next few months. We're looking at probably the end of the year or much later for that. So what I have highlighted for you on our table of contents are the geothermal resources that are available on the portal. But as I said, please note that there are a whole series of different data sets that you can access and visualize on the geology portal. So let me just sort of go through the ones that are available for geothermal. We, of course, have the permit locations that are now. Many of these data sets are a couple of years out of date and they are due for a refresh, which is something that is on our agenda to do in the near term. So these are permit locations that exist for geothermal resources. Um, then we also have direct use, which are these are closed loop systems. So think your ground source heat pumps that are using a closed loop in a borehole exchanger, or either horizontal or vertical. And then we have open loop systems scattered throughout the state. Same idea, most of them are ground source heat pumps, but these are now just utilizing groundwater and circulating them through the heat pump system. There is the thermal and mineral spring database that is involved here. These are coded to their highest temperature in the measurement set. Let me go ahead and remove those so you can see better just the thermal mineral springs. And sometimes these things do not go away when they should. So the thermal and mineral springs, please note that some of I'd say most of the sites here are neither thermal nor mineral. They are springs of which data were collected largely as a result of that 2009 through 2014 Department of Energy funding. And those sites, many of them were collected in areas of known geothermal potential, but many of the sites, of course, are just groundwater springs that are non-thermal. But it gives you a sense of the distribution of the data, and linked in each of these sites, if you were to click on one of them, it gives you the basic metadata about each site. And then underneath of it, there are various links where you can then view the individual chemistry measurements that were archived and or collected during that campaign, most of which were in like 2010 to 2012 from our part, and then the other stuff was much older, collected by others. It also collects or includes the sources. This information may not mean much immediately, but these link to relational tables with references and other data products so that you can sort of combine this with our other resources to know what studies were done, who did those studies. Um, and other resources connected to each of those sites. There are photos for many of the sites that are included, and then temperature data. And the reason this is listed separately is that some of these temperature readings do not have associated geochemistry measurements. And so there's a somewhat misalignment sometimes between just the data of the temperatures versus data of the geochemistry because there's more of the temperature measurements than the geochemistry. So that information is included for each of these sites. Um, Also in the portal are sites where over the years measurements of geothermal gradient was measured in wells. And then there are areas where geothermal gradient was calculated in wells, not, rather than just measured based upon bottom hole temperatures. And then finally, we have our potential map, which you saw in that story map slide that I showed earlier. So that's the potential. And then based upon socioeconomic factors, terrain, accessibility based upon the type of land that it's on, and then generally whether or not you can actually get to it. Also things such as like proximity to transmission lines. There is a whole series of different weighted calculations that were included in the translated and the potential to a measurement of favorability that was then presented in that 2021 report. And as you can see, that changes dramatically based upon those additional factors and the weighting involved in assessing those factors against the potential for geothermal. So that is, I think, all I have to share at the moment. And again, part of this was an introduction so that Jonathan could show you what he has been able to do within the data of the portal, pulling it out to run calculations of his own on. And I'll pause there. Certainly can answer questions that you might have at this point about that. Um, Thank you very much. And it looks like I've got a hand up, and that's from Delano.
Hey Lee, thank you
Yeah.
for the presentation. Good information. Do you know how often the Washington Geological Information Portal is updated? Just curious on the interval in which they take in new data points to add
Yeah.
to this map.
That's a great point. It varies based upon the data type, right? So some of these data layers, not the ones that I've shown you, but geologic mapping, their geophysical data, those get updated fairly frequently because those are internal data that we are collecting ourselves and are able to launch new instances of those data layers. Things such as like the permit locations, open and closed loop direct use systems. Those are not data that we collect ourselves, but there are data that we have to go out and scavenge from like Department of Ecology permitting and others. So those get updated less frequently, and it's been my best guess. I'd have to look at this, but it's been several years since these were updated, and they are due for a refresh.
I get you. I was just
Yeah,
wondering about that since Central Washington was in the middle, are currently in the process of developing Opalupis, so I was kind of looking for that permit.
exactly.
And,
And
and,
yeah, go
and I
ahead.
will say that for Ellensburg, I was kind of curious when I saw the geothermal potential. And we're kind of in a very light blue area,
Yeah, yeah,
and thus far we're seeing good temperature or gradient temperatures for utilization for building heating and cooling, not
right.
electrical generation. We hope to eventually do a depth that would be able to provide that. So, kind of hoping, to be honest, that some of the graphics we're seeing there is a little bit conservative. So we'll see.
Yeah, and let me just give you like the clear sort of like background here that this was created in with electricity in mind at the time. And certainly there's geothermal everywhere, right? You know, in the terms of using it for ground source heat
Right.
pumps, the temperature is less important to that. It is the differential between your waters that you're circulating and the ambient groundwater, right? So that is this does not reflect that. The other piece is this also doesn't reflect deep rocks that you might have as AGS or EGS potential,
Hmm.
because that was also not part of the way that this was developed. And the AGS is augmented and EGS is enhanced, right? So those are deeper geothermal systems in deep crystalline rock or otherwise. So those are those are important to that because when you see blue like you were doing in your area, that does not necessarily mean that you couldn't drill deeper and get something. It also means that there wasn't maybe enough data there to be able to create an accurate map for that area.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Lee. That was an excellent introduction into what I'm about to talk about. And thanks, Ed, and everybody on the call. So, yeah, this is a perspective comparative techno-economic analysis using data from the play fairway analysis and the portal to look at what sorts of LCOEs, IRRs, NPVs we can get if we were to take essentially the gradients and the thermal conductivity in Washington State and model those on the latest data from Fervo Cape Station. So with that, we will begin. We'll start with just a quick overview of the prospect areas, which Lee touched on a bit. Then I'll talk about some of the concerns around EGS techno-economics and using geofires and the geofires case study of Cape Station that we recently released, and then going into the actual comparative techno-economic analysis for Washington State based on that. So first, a quick blurb about me. I have a background in software engineering, currently have my own LLC where I focus on techno-economic analysis, primarily NREL's geofires, who I collaborate with on an ongoing basis. There's also, I believe, Jeff Bordier in this call who collaborates on it as well, who I believe just won the Geode Datathon for his project. So thank you, Jeff, for continuing to be a part of the project. Yeah, a couple of disclaimers. These are all my views and analysis, and results are effectively in preprint right now where applicable. There are references in the case study and also in the results site that I'll be sharing. And then also geothermal is very interdisciplinary, and there are many things that I am not. And so my focus is on building software that captures the expert consensus on the techno-economics. And so we will be looking at the prospects from that lens. So first, revisiting the portal with the prospect areas highlighted here, just to give context for the areas we're talking about. And pertinent to what Lee mentioned about the blue areas, there may not be data in the portal showing favorability, but the play fairway analysis does have data for these specific sites. So first we'll start with Mount Baker, and here we've got gradients from the play fairway analysis and the portal from around 60 C per km to 64. And this is a screenshot of one of the data points in the portal. You'll also see here I have built a little integration into the portal that lets you calculate techno-economics based on Fervo Cape Station right in the portal. We might have time for a demo for that in the Q&A section, but that's just a quick snapshot of what the techno-economics might look like for each site, which we'll obviously be getting into much greater depth.
Hey, Jonathan, could I ask a quick question? I'm not familiar with the term techno-economics. Could you explain that?
It's a way to say that you have a technical specification of the project and then economic parameters and computing metrics like your LCOE, your NPV, your cash flow, that sort of thing. So it's sort of at a layer of a certain amount of granularity on the technical side, a certain amount of granularity on the financial and economic side, and putting together a screening analysis of a possible project.
Okay, so is that a kind of a feasibility metric? Like, is the resource there, and then do the economics work out?
Yeah, it's less about the reservoir modeling or like the site characterization and more about once you know what your geology is and what kind of flow rate you can produce, what kind of depth you can get to. It's more on that side. It does do some the tool in question, GeoFires, does do some amount of reservoir modeling, but yeah, it's less on the geological characterization side and more on the economic screening side once you have those characteristics. But thank you for that question. Yes.
Thank you.
And so the main driver here that we're using in this presentation is the temperature gradient, because that's the biggest driver of what is the enthalpy of the fluid that you can produce to drive your power plant. And it is generally assumed that it's a linear relationship. That's not always true in reality. But basically, we're saying here we have data that's calibrated from Cape Station for a 500 megawatt EGS plant that has a known gradient, and it has known reservoir density, heat capacity, thermal conductivity. What happens when we take the gradients that are validated in the PFA and then displayed in the geological portal, and the thermal conductivities, and then we project those and say, what if we wanted to build a Cape Station in Washington State? What would it look like? So that's sort of the lens that we're taking on this, which is there are many geological factors that I'm not going to speak on because I'm not an expert on. But at the end of the day, we're saying if these gradients are achievable within sites in these areas, here's what it looks like.
Hey,
This is
Jonathan.
Song from Houston, Texas. I have a quick question regarding the production net. What does that net mean?
That's average net electricity production.
You mean after conversion from the heat to the electricity?
Correct. After heat from conversion to electricity, and then also accounting for pumping losses.
Okay, so what's the efficiency, general efficiency you applied for converting?
The efficiency is driven by correlations that are in GeoFires, and I don't want to say the wrong number here, but I believe for ORC at 200, it's around 14 to 15%, but that is part of the simulation, and we can look at that if we have time. Trenton, I see your hands raised.
Hey, Jonathan. This is great. I like this work. And 14% is right on your ORC question. I think his answer is about right. But what area? So obviously the area is the big part of this input that you're not showing. So what sort of area to get to? And the 518 megawatts is actually pretty eye-opening, of course, for that area. But I think it depends a lot on what's area would be developable. So how's that input?
You mean in terms of the surface area of the plant itself?
No, no, well, I would say, no, I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about the area or volume of rock, hot rock being mined.
Right. Yeah, so there are reservoir volume calculations that are modeled on the the extrapolations that we used for in the Fervo Cape Station study. So the Cape Station study that we did, we projected 59 doublets with fracture separation of 18 meters and fracture height, square fractures of a height 165 meters. And I think overall it came out to around 12,000 fractures for the whole system. So we have the results for what those reservoir volumes translate into, and I'm not making an assertion that those volumes are necessarily achievable or that that's the amount of heat in place. It is saying if we have this gradient and we're able to commercially deploy and replicate what Fervo's done with these gradients, here's what it looks like. So I'm sure someone, you and many other people could speak more intelligently to some of those nuances around the heat in place and the reservoir engineering and those sorts of concerns.
Got it. Okay, so it's really 59 wells, I suppose, is the real scalar here. If you could get 59 wells in that area, if you could fit them all in, then you could produce the 520 net.
59 doublets, so 118 wells.
Oh, 118 wells.
Yes.
That's a lot of wells.
It is, yes. And 500 megawatts is, as some have pointed out, a very large project. We do have a case study for a 50 megawatt project that was not part of this analysis, but we do have some examination of that as well. We can discuss offline if desired. Yeah, and we'll get much more in depth. These are just a very quick integration with the portal I did to just say, okay, I have this gradient. What does it look like with the default? But there's a lot of analysis we'll be getting into with this. So yeah, so this is Baker. It's got 60 on the low end, 60 to 64, and that's validated as far as I know. Mount St. Helens from the PFA, I believe, had 112, and that shows up in the geological portal. That's a very favorable gradient. There's also this point here. If you can see my mouse, comes out to 15C. So we will be looking at what 15C looks like as a basis for comparison. It's because it's not economical, but so that's when we look at St. Helens, we'll be looking at 15 to 112. And then we've also got Wind River Valley, which the geological portal has gradients. I was able to find calculated gradients from 50 to 100C. And then the play fairway analysis also mentions gradients from 160 to 166C. So we will be looking at so they're at 74C. So these areas have gradients that are favorable compared to Fervo. And then I also pulled some data on the thermal conductivity, like I mentioned earlier. Fervo does seem to have higher thermal conductivity than what we would expect in the prospect areas, but it still is it's plenty high to be economically viable, as we'll see. These are speculative EGS target depths based on those gradients. So for the Mount St. Helens case, the assumption was that there wouldn't be EGS project development for gradients lower than 50 degrees, actually for Wind River as well. So if you're wondering about the 15C, that's not accounted for in this particular graph here. So, and that's to reach 200C, which is what Fervo is at. Cape Station. Then touching back on Techno-Economics. So the DOE has set a Earthshot target of $45 per megawatt hour, or 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour. They're the same thing in case you're used to thinking of one or the other. And yeah, the main
thing in the mainstream of geothermal is all the industry hype around Fervo and whether they can achieve techno-economics that start to approach this Earthshot target. And also, it looks like they may not even need to have pretty good outcomes. So, yeah, there's some interesting flags in the ground for what sorts of economics could be achieved on the broader scale. So the financial analysis tool that I primarily work on in collaboration with NREL and others like Jeff it's called GeoFires. It has a history going back to the 1970s. It's been worked on by a number of experts. I, again, do not claim to be an expert, just somebody who keeps the code working and integrates the expert consensus. And recently, we've updated the GeoFires economic calculations with the system advisor model financial model. And this gives us economic calculations that are based on a pro forma cash flow analysis, which is much more accurate than any of the other economic models we previously had in GeoFires. So we're now able to use GeoFires as a plausibly realistic economic model of what these projects might actually achieve in the real world. Now, there's many caveats to that, but the key point is we're looking in the realm of what we would expect real life achievability to be. And this is a screenshot just of the some of the cash flow analysis, just to give you an idea. It has about, I think it's 683 different line items, and it accounts for state and federal tax liability and debt interest payment balance and pretty much every financial metric you can think of. So if you don't trust the numbers that are shown, you can go look in the cash flow table and see where you disagree, as a general principle. And then briefly establishing the baseline with the Fervo Cape Station. We recently worked on a case study that we validated with a number of experts and across various references. These are the key results for Fervo. So we found an LCOE of $75.50 per megawatt hour. That's in line with Roland Horn's paper that was published in Nature recently of around 80. We've got CapEx of comes out to around $4,900 per kilowatt. Fervo claims $5,000, so we're in line with that. Fervo is also claiming $3.96 million per well, and we were able to calibrate that based on NREL's latest cost curve drilling updates. And yeah, this is our WACC, our IRR. If we had more time, we would go more in depth to this, but the key point here is this is how GeoFires models Cape Station economics based on the publicly available data that we have. And this is the baseline that we're about to use and go project onto what scenarios in Washington State might look like. Okay, so that's transitioning into the specific analysis we've done here. The objective is to assess that EGS potential. And as I've said, we've modeled a 500 megawatt EGS project. I adapted it with Washington State specific taxes and thermal conductivities, which is, there's a couple of parameters that affect that. We won't go into that at the moment, but that's essentially taking this Washington adapted Cape Station equivalent, and then looking at it when we put the various gradients from the prospect areas, and then also there's some Monte Carlo and parametric analysis we'll be looking at as well. And if you'd like to look at the web version of these results, it's available at this URL, and that'll be through the presentation, so no rush to try to copy it just this second. The key findings are, if we assume a baseline gradient of around 50 to 60, we may be looking at LCOEs of around 8 to 8.6% and around 27% IRR, which is considered very good. And then for the higher gradient prospect areas, LCOEs from 6.7 to 7.2 cents might be achievable, and even higher IRR. So at
face value, this analysis is showing that there appears to be good economic viability and perhaps even very good economic viability for these gradients. So the methodology here, we did a couple of types of comparisons. So number one, I did an LCOE comparison for a 200 Celsius plant that's essentially the 1-to-1 Cape Station equivalent with the gradients. I also did a production temperature analysis, so looking at what is the potential of going hotter and even up to super hot, up to 450 degrees C, and that's related to some other work I'm working on with another client, which happened to be I was able to kind of plug it into this analysis, so that's interesting. And then I was able to also perform some parametric analysis that's looking at water loss rate and production flow rate and cost overrun factors. So we'll see if we can get to all these things. So number one, so this is the first graph from our LCOE comparison. So when we go and take the Washington State tax structure and thermal conductivity, and we use a 74C gradient under these assumptions, we get an LCOE of around 7.5 cents. And then here we see the other prospect areas and some of their key gradients compared. So 50 is obviously going to be less than 74 because it's not as you have to drill deeper to get the same amount of enthalpy. 100 is going to be more favorable. 160 is favorable. 166 is favorable as well. Likewise, Mount Baker in both of the ranges, you can see we have LCOEs around 8.4 to, 8 to 7.75-ish. And then Mount St. Helens at 112 is good. And then also, as I mentioned, we've got that 15C data point just to show this. This is an indication this goes off the scale up to around 23 cents. So 15C is not economically viable. This is that same chart, but with IRR instead of LCOE. IRR is after-tax internal rate of return, and it's a common metric used to evaluate these sorts of projects. Typical renewable energy returns, my understanding is, can be in the range of 15 to 25%. These are a little bit above that. There may be some adjustments and real world scenarios that may affect these, but as a comparative basis, that's primarily what we're looking at, and we see that we're in the realm of very favorable returns on these projects. How are we doing on time? Okay, yeah, we're just gonna have to keep going. So another metric that you can use for these projects is net present value, which is if net present value is greater than 0, then it is a good investment. If it's less, then it's a bad investment. And so for all of these gradients, you get a positive NPV, which means they are, from a mathematical standpoint, they should be investable. Again, 15C for reference is not investable. It's worth less than $1 billion, negative $1 billion. So yeah, that's NPV. There's also another metric, profitability index, which is used to assess these types of projects. Again, many of these are their same side, different sides of the same coin, but just looking through the various lenses. With profitability index, a value of 1.0 or greater is considered investable, and all of these are comfortably above 1.0. So that's great news. Okay, then this is also we've got these figures in data form here, just for another basis for comparison, and touching back on Trenton's question about the size of the plants. This is so we have 59 doublets for our Cape Station benchmark. We adjusted the doublets incrementally here to meet a minimum net generation of 500 megawatts. So for the Cape Station case study, we assumed that their PPA means that they must not fall below a minimum net generation of 500 megawatts over the 30-year project lifetime. That may or may not be true for reality, but this is the assumptions that we use when we're looking at what does a 500 megawatt PPA mean. If we interpret it to mean that we must be able to deliver at least 500 megawatts net at all times, these are the number of doublets that are required due to effects of drawdown. So there's some slight adjustments there. And as we see, we need significantly more for 15C because you just have to go that much deeper. You have more production wellbore temperature loss, and that's one of the reasons that it's so negative. Okay. I also did a production temperature analysis, which is a slightly different benchmark scenario that is optimized to look at comparing like for like across bottom hole temperatures. So the results of this show that we could so right now Fervo's at 200C, and there are potentially benefits in the future to even going hotter or super hot. The results suggest we could get up to a 25% lower LCOE for super hot for an nth of kind. It lowers capex, which is good. There's also potentially higher IRR for nth of kind with super hot. And so these bars show the average across the gradient scenarios, and then these whiskers show the standard deviation, and then the faint bars behind there show the maximum that's achievable under all of the scenarios. So the super hot IRR could even, as indicated by this bar, could go even higher than that. So that's an area that some people are working on, and some of the results for that look promising. Okay. Oh yeah. I don't know if we're going to have time for all of these graphs, but this is another look into the production temperature analysis data by gradient, and then also comparing it with a reference LCOE for natural gas combined cycle. That's what NGCC is. So looking at under this scenario, which is actually has higher LCOEs because it's modeled without the investment tax credit. Looking at where's the point where you reach competitiveness with natural gas. And it looks like for all of our gradients, we actually can achieve that at just around 300C or less. So that's great news. This is a look at your drilling and completion costs per well under a nth of kind scenario, which is drilling being the cost being the main driver of techno-economics. And this is a model that is calibrated to some of the learning curves that we've been seeing. This is well depth. Looking at how we saw an earlier slide on the speculative EGS target depths. This is another look at for the specific gradients. What depth would you have to go to achieve a specific bottom hole production temperature? Another IRR look here. Let's see. There's one. Another interesting thing about going hotter is that you need fewer production wells, which is good. That's why it's one of the reasons you need less capex, even though the per well cost increases. So that's a good thing, and may be a factor that favors going hotter over time. Yeah, so that's our production temperature analysis. Again, there's a results site here. I'll be sending that out, and it's in preprint, so there will be plenty of time to look at those after this presentation. Next, talking about some of our sensitivity analysis. One of the most common concerns for EGS is water loss rate. People ask what happens if the water loss rate is much higher than projected. So here, this is just a simple parametric analysis looking at on the lower end. I believe Fervo, I believe this is public now, is claiming around a half percent water loss rate for the full project. So that's what that is on the bottom end here. And then I modeled all the way up to a 30% water loss rate, which is on the higher end here. And this is mainly looking at the cost of water if you model it at the default correlation of $3.50 per 1,000 gallons of loss. And just going to show, there is an impact on the economics. If we go towards the lower end of what Fervo is claiming on this side of the graph, then the economics look all the better. And yeah, that will just be a question of what does the long-term data start showing? What is the reservoir engineering and performance outcome? But this is what it looks like under those scenarios. Next, I also performed a 2D parametric analysis that's looking at the LCOE and also the other metrics under various flow rate and cost adjustment factors. So essentially on our x-axis here, we are looking at starting with our default adjustment factor of 0.8, which is the value that is equivalent to what Cape Station is claiming. So this is the 0.8 is what Cape Station, what Fervo is effectively claiming right now. All the way up to I think the max value I used here was 1.5, 1.6. So up to substantially 50% or higher cost overrun on your drilling and completion costs. What does your LCOE start to look like under those scenarios? And then also looking at the flow rate that you're able to achieve. So Cape Station, I don't think they're publicly claiming a specific value, but for Project Red, I believe they claimed a 93 kilograms per second per well flow rate, stable flow rate. And then they claimed a peak of 120 kilograms per well per second. The value that we used in our case study was 107 kilograms per second, and that was based on an increase, an extrapolated increase from another paper with another simulation they did. So Fervo is claiming flow rates in this regime. Obviously, well, we do generally get lower LCOEs with higher flow rates. NREL has conservative and moderate scenarios for production well flow rate that are in the 60 to 80 kilograms per second per well range. And then I also modeled down even to 40 kilograms per second per well. So this would essentially be a disappointing, we go build the project in Washington and there's disappointing reservoir performance. What do our economics start to look like at that point? And the good news is that there are favorable LCOEs along the spectrum of potential flow rates. As your potential cost overruns get higher, obviously the LCOEs are negatively affected, but this is to demonstrate that you can create a decision-making matrix of your outcomes and set targets for what do I need to achieve if I'm trying to meet a certain LCOE. And one of the interesting outcomes here you might notice is that going to a higher flow rate doesn't always immediately equal a better LCOE, because the GeoFires model is actually accounting for redrilling. So you can incrementally increase your flow rate such that it requires you to redrill in order to meet your production target. And that redrilling costs you more than the increased revenue that you get from increasing the flow rate. So that's why you see these different bands where you're in these drawdown windows 4 different flow rates up to a point where your the increased electricity production starts to outweigh the increased drilling costs. So yeah, that's the effect on LCOE for those factors, and there are many parametric analyses you could perform with all of the variables that affect this type of project. This is just some of the more economically impactful ones. We've also, this is the same analysis done for the internal rate of return, the IRR, and we can see here the results largely are in agreement with around 75 kilograms per well per second being an optimal regime. 100 is also very close, but the key point here is that there are favorable economic sweet spots across a wide range of engineering outcomes and resource quality as well. Okay, so yeah, I think we're doing good on time. Yeah, again, just to recap some of the findings here, we can. It looks like in Washington State, if the gradients that are in the play fairway analysis and the geologic information portal, if we're able to replicate an EGS project like Cape Station, we could achieve LCOEs and rates of return that are favorable. And if some of the higher gradients are also present, that makes for even better economics. So it's overall, it looks like a great picture for Washington State, and the geothermal could be a bright spot in the state's future, at least according to the findings that we have here. And with that, we've got a couple of minutes for Q&A. So yeah, I will pause there. And looks like Delano, you've got your hand raised.
Jonathan, exceptional information. This is the kind of data decision-making stuff that I've been looking for. So I really appreciate you putting it together. I'm going to ask to get in contact with you offline for some more deep dive for my team on this. 2 quick questions for you. First is, does the cost analysis of this consider transmission as part of its calculation of development or not?
It does not. And that would be one factor. So I mentioned typical IRR might be around 15 to 25%, and we're looking at 27%. That would be one of those items that would lower your expected IRR a bit.
Okay.
Geofires can model transmission costs, though.
Okay, and that's going to be an important thing, especially for rural areas where that's, yeah. Just curious about that. And then the biggest thing is on the profitability index. Is 1.0 representative of 100% ROI, or is that I guess what goes into that? And you don't have to answer that now. We could talk about it offline, but just curious about what does 1.0 represent on that profitability index?
I would have to go make sure I'm crossing my T's and dotting my I's before I say that. But yes, we can talk about that offline.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I've got a lot of questions for you, and I would love to do a much more detailed dive into the geotech economics of this, because I think this is where it all happens. And representing a higher education institution, this is where we see the biggest opportunity. So thank you. I got to jump to another meeting, but thank you.
Outstanding. Thank you, Delano.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. That was fantastic. Really appreciate all the work that went into this, and hope that you do get some more follow-up from people offline. I will remind people that Jonathan is a consultant, and this was all a public-spirited work, but I won't say the devil's in the details. The angels are also in the details, and I'm sure Jonathan would be happy to help anyone on a real development project. Anything else before we go? I will share our, if I can, let's see, the our link to our climate week. So we'd love to see people in person. We're building a community here, so looking forward to seeing as many people as we can in Seattle on the 17th of July. So thanks everybody for joining today, and stay tuned for future webinars.
Thank you. Great presentations. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Thanks.
come to our
Bye,
event.
everybody.
Come to Climate Week, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
It was good. I updated the Luma event while we were on.
Yeah, I'll go in there right after this is over.
Yeah, I think you'll like it.
I'm sure I will. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no problem. All right, I've got to jump. We've got
Yeah.
the climate accelerator launch is happening over in the fishbowl right now. I got
Very good. Okay.
See you
We'll see
later.
you guys later. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right. Bye, everybody.